Let me say two things before I go into this talk. First of all, when Dave contacted me, I checked out, read up about Ethos Week and about the university, and I decided very much that I wanted to do this because I truly believe that what you are setting out to accomplish, talk about, analyze, and make part of your life is essentially what needs to be done in order to correct what I think are the significant problems that we have not only in the business community, but in our community as a whole as it relates to issues involving ethics and our obligations as citizens of this country and our obligations to one another. And I've spent a large part of my life involved in both sides of this whole equation, being a former United States attorney where I oversaw the indictment and conviction of people involved and in defending individuals and working with universities, not as well as business organizations in dealing with these problems. And it starts here. So I'm proud and delighted that you asked me to speak to you, and I hope that there's some things I can say that will be of assistance to you. The second thing, and I make this very clear, I'm looking at the president right now, I normally charge a fee of some significance. Not true, but I will in this case. So we have a, what is it, ladies' eagles or women's eagles right now? And I don't have any memorabilia from the university, so I expect that there's something will be delivered here. Okay? September 14th, 2008, 7:55 p.m. Eastern Time. For those who are in the business and finance community, they know exactly where they were at that time, because it was shortly thereafter that an email or communication came out to announce something that was unthinkable. That date and time may not mean much to you, but it sets in place and in motion what we are now living through. It marks one of the most extraordinary phone calls in the history of the United States business. That phone call came on day 3 of a marathon weekend during which the top government officials of the United States dealing in worlds of finance, as well as the President of the United States in Washington waiting for the word as to what was taking place, had closeted themselves with the top financial business officials from across the United States and indeed from across the world in the Federal Reserve Building in Lower Manhattan. They had been there locked in literally for 3 days, desperately trying to find a way to save Lehman Brothers, one of the world's largest, most sophisticated, and nuanced organizations, hoping to stave off what one Lehman lawyer described as a disaster of unlimited proportions. And when I say top, I mean SEC Chairman Cox was there, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson was there, New York Fed Chairman Tim Geithner, now Secretary of Treasury, was there, the CEOs of JP Morgan Chase, Citicorp, UBS, Barclays, not some low-level individuals, the very top. But by late Sunday afternoon, it had become clear that there was going to be no rescue. The Fed couldn't or wouldn't provide a bailout. The private sector could not or would not buy Lehman's questionable assets. And the last best hope that Barclays Bank would purchase Lehman Brothers, that hope was dashed by regulators in London who did not want that to take place and would not permit it to occur without a long delay. There was no more time left. The best and the brightest, truly the best and the brightest, had run out of time, run out of ideas, and run out of ability to prevent the impending disaster. Mr. Paulson, Mr. Geithner insisted that Chairman Cox, as Lehman's regulator, should deliver the news that bankruptcy was the only remaining option. Chairman Cox learned that the board of Lehman Brothers was in extraordinary session in New York, waiting to get news, thinking they were there to vote the approval of a deal to sell Lehman to Barclays. Chairman Cox asked to be piped into the boardroom. and put on speakerphone. And then over the phone, with Secretary Paulson standing next to him, when President Geithner delivered the following. And I'm quoting from, all these quotes are quotes that you'll hear from the interviews that I did or my team did with these individuals. Cox told the board he was not, quote, offering guidance or trying to influence the board in its fiduciary responsibilities or the responsibilities of the directors, but he believed it was important for the board to understand that they needed to make a decision and communicate it to the markets immediately. He told the board that the Federal Reserve believed that Lehman should declare bankruptcy immediately before the market opened. John Akers, former chairman of the board of IBM and a Lehman board member, recalls that the board's attorney asked Cox over the phone, "Is the government of the United States ordering Lehman Brothers to go into bankruptcy?" Cox responded, quote, "I'm not telling you to do anything, but the markets are opening in Asia soon, and we've already expressed our opinion to your people." The board was stunned. Not a single member of the board we interviewed, and we interviewed them several times, had thought that bankruptcy was a real possibility before Cox made that call. The board believed then, and they believe now, at least as of the last time we interviewed them, that the government could have and should have stepped in to save Lehman Brothers. But with the government saying that it would not, there were no other options. Lehman did not have sufficient liquidity to open for business the following day. Angry and stunned, the board passed a resolution instructing Lehman's lawyers to file bankruptcy immediately. That was the phone call that took place at 7:55 p.m. And the consequences are what we are living with today. Lehman's bankruptcy set off a global economic calamity. The Dow Jones plunged 500 points the next morning on the news. Lehman's bankruptcy was the largest bankruptcy in history. Scheduled assets of $694 billion. That's how large the bankruptcy was. It was larger than the next 5 bankruptcies stacked up together: Washington Mutual, WorldCom, Enron, General Motors, and CIT. Indeed, one reporter claimed that it was larger. If you took all the bankruptcies in history and stacked them up, they would not be as large as the Lehman bankruptcy. In Lehman's case, the speed of its demise was truly breathtaking. 8 months before declaring bankruptcy, on January 2nd, 2008, the share price of Lehman Brothers was north of $65, implying a market capitalization of about $35 billion. Lehman reported record earnings, the most revenue in its history, and record earnings in excess of $4 billion in a fiscal year ending November 30th, 2007. Lehman executives were paid billions of dollars in bonuses as a result of that record year. 8 months later, September 12, 2008, as they began Lehman Weekend, Lehman stock closed at under $4 a share. And by Sunday, September 14th, it was worthless. Why did Lehman fail? How could this have happened? How could this have taken place over an 8-month period of time? How could this have happened while the world was watching? Lehman's executives were among the best and the brightest on Wall Street. They had access to the finest legal talent and top accountants and analysts. They were under such strict government control that there were, in fact, SEC investigators who were on the Lehman premises for the 8 months preceding the bankruptcy and given full access to the books and records. Still, Lehman failed and failed fast. Lehman's problems started with a strategic error in business judgment. That error put Lehman in dire states, but they complicated and compounded that problem by their actions, which in some respects you may conclude were improper and unethical. Lehman deceived itself about the extent of the problem and concealed it from investors and the public. And when Lehman engaged in conduct which should have tripped ethical alarms, they did not. They did not trip the alarms, and they didn't listen when they were tripped. On January 20th, 2009, about 4 months after Lehman declared bankruptcy, a federal court in New York asked me to be the examiner and to write a report, the substance of which was going to be, at least in some large part, What caused this bankruptcy? Who was responsible? Was it the government? Was it Lehman executives? Was this an act of God? Was this short sellers? Who did it? In virtually all of the major bankruptcies where an examiner has been appointed, and I do not practice in bankruptcy court. That's not where I do. I'm a litigator. In all those others, Enron, WorldCom, Revco, in all those instances, before the examiner began, we pretty much understood why the entity had failed, what criminal behavior engaged in, etc. With Lehman Brothers, no one truly knew why this happened. It was tabula rasa. My team and I collected approximately 34 million pages of documents. The total database was actually 250 billion documents. We narrowed it down to 34 million. We interviewed 248 witnesses, ranging from relatively low-level analysts to Warren Buffett, Secretary Paulson, Secretary Geithner, Chairman Cox, Chairman Bernanke. We interviewed the Lehman board members. The Lehman board was considered to be an exemplary board. We're talking about the people who headed IBM, headed other major banks. Former deputy chairman of the Fed was on that board. We are talking about the best and the brightest. My job as the examiner was to determine why Lehman failed and to identify whether somebody could be held legally accountable for the failure. I was not the policeman for Lehman's business ethics. I did not comment on Lehman's business ethics in my report. That would not have been proper. But I'm going to lay it out for you today and let you draw your own conclusions as to where those failures might exist. And it is much more subtle than you may think. Much more subtle. Many of the facts that I investigated illuminated some of the critical ethical issues facing business leaders and others today. They are issues that many of you may face in your life, professional and otherwise. We are a society of rights and obligation, but the question that needs to be addressed is, quote, is behavior acceptable if you can say that somehow it falls within the confines of the law? So if it's legally acceptable, is that the end of the analysis? Meaning, as long as you don't violate a specific statute or a specific legal obligation, is it acceptable behavior? During the heat and frenzy of making the billions of dollars which were made on Wall Street at that time, I think the question was frequently answered by simply saying, if it was within the chalk lines, it was acceptable. The question is that the standard which we want to apply? Or is the law just simply the lowest common denominator of acceptable behavior? And aren't we supposed to be assessing a higher standard? And what are the consequences when we don't? Lehman is one of those consequences. The dean asked me today told me that the theme was to do the right thing. And it is fair to ask, and especially important for this group to ask, did Lehman's executive and board of directors do the right thing? What lessons can be learned, and how do those lessons apply to what you're going to be doing? Lehman's executive faced some hard questions. The way they answer those questions changed our financial history. Lehman's chapter in the history books is not unique. The names and faces may change, and the buzzwords we hear in the media may change, but like several other aspects of history, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In times of prosperity, we choose to believe that the systems we put in place will protect us against misconduct and excessive practices. And as a result, we engage in some self-deception and ignore warning signs of dangers that, in retrospect, seem obvious. We forget that human beings are given to greed and avarice and will take advantage of opportunities in short-term gain at the expense of long-term potential harm. And we fail to take individual responsibility for doing the right thing and ignore the consequences when we don't. Our generation is not the first to suffer from this arrogance. March 29th, 1929, New York Herald Tribune announced, quote, stocks soar as bank aides end fear of money panic. In other essence, don't worry, we're okay. 6 months later, on the eve of the stock market crash, Secretary Treasurer Andrew Mellon at that time assured the public that, quote, there is no cause to worry, the high tide of prosperity will continue, close quote. In short, people believed that the system we had in place would correct itself and was self-correcting. It had nothing to do with people, the system will correct itself. 80 years later, in July of 2008, remember the bankruptcies in September, in July of 2008, Secretary Paulson says, quote, it is a safe banking system, a sound banking system. Our regulators are on top of it. This is a very manageable situation, period, close quote. Anybody see the similarities there? Notwithstanding Secretary Paulson's assurances, within 4 months, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were being taken over by the federal government. Lehman Brothers went into bankruptcy, and AIG was provided with $180 billion to bail it out, and had they not, we would be in a depression right now. In the Great Depression, as in today's economy, the questionable conduct may have been legal or may have operated in gray areas. Indeed, it may have been viewed at the time and praised as being creative, but it was nevertheless destructive. Once the consequences of this conduct became evident and the behavior exposed to public scrutiny, society realized, as we are now, that it just can't be tolerated. In the 90s, when lawyers and accountants devised complex transactions that yielded profits or tax savings that had an economic substance, they have been praised as being creative. Professionals, but in hindsight, those transactions turned out to be disasters. A decade ago, it was Enron and WorldCom. Enron's questionable accounting practices had been lauded in the press and praised as the handiwork of, quote, the smartest guys in the room, close quote. Fortune magazine named Enron as, quote, the most innovative company, close quote, for 6 consecutive years. You bet they were innovative. The illegal conduct and the excessive practices only came to light, and when they came to light, they came in spectacular session. Enron in the wake of 9/11, WorldCom in 2002 on the heels of a downturn in the telecommunications industry, Bernie Madoff in the midst of the financial meltdown. And these all come when, in fact, the economy turns sour. In both Enron and WorldCom, top executives were convicted of crime. But what was more important is that other executives and lawyers and accountants looked the other way while these activities were taking place, found a way to justify or accept it. And it was only after the disaster that we learned what had taken place. Warren Buffett's great quote, which is, when the tide goes out, we find out who's been swimming nude. And that's what happened. Enron and WorldCom illustrate an important truism about corporate culture. It starts at the top. An ethical culture in any company must start at the top. It is up to the company's leaders to create and keep a culture of ethics, a culture of compliance, a culture of lawful behavior, and then some. Dick Fold, who was the chairman, our CEO of Lehman Brothers, told Congress that Lehman was a victim of a bad economy. He called it a financial tsunami. He was wrong. Lehman was not the passive victim of circumstances. Lehman made its own decisions. Some of those decisions, business decisions, turned out to be flat wrong. And you may judge those decisions are unethical or potentially actionable, but it was those decisions that brought Lehman Brothers down, not something else. We all know that financial executives have a fiduciary obligation to maximize shareholder value, to seek profits, but it is up to the corporate leaders to ensure that they do so in the right way. The right way involves ensuring a culture of lawful and ethical compliance. An ethical and effective leader instills a culture where doing the right thing is rewarded and illegal and unethical behavior is not. A hallmark of an ethical corporate culture is to encourage each employee to take full ownership or the task for which they are charged, to question management, to question decisions which should not be made, not to sit passively by and to go along. In 2010, an oil rig operated by BP exploded in the Gulf. 5 million barrels of crude oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico. President Obama appointed a commission to investigate the course of the explosion. the chief counsel for the commission made a report. Here's one of his conclusions. The disaster occurred because, quote, there was a lack of culture or leadership by which people were told to take responsibility for their actions. It created the problems which led to the disaster. In other words, people holding positions of responsibility did not ask questions. They did not question things they should have been asking, and they did not speak up to challenge decisions they thought were inappropriate. The chief counsel went on to say, high decision makers must act, quote, with a single-minded determination to ask questions and pursue advice until they got it right. And that wasn't what was happening there, and it certainly wasn't what was happening in Lehman Brothers. If we want to be serious about deterring those practices in a meaningful and systematic way, we might give thought to a couple of things. Who are the people engaged in these practices, and what systemic factors lead to their activity? We can divide people into 4 categories. We have those who are incorruptible. I would point, because of me, to a person by the name of Edward Levy, who was the former dean of the law school at the University of Chicago, went on to be Attorney General of the United States, and probably one of the most ethical men I've ever met in my life. An extraordinary person, totally uncorruptible. On the other extreme, we have Bernie Madoff, okay, who, given the opportunity, or he would create the opportunity to be a crook. So we're not going to deter Bernie Madoff. The best we can do is create a system and prosecute him and put him away. Those are not the individuals we're talking about. Most individuals are in between, or a large number are, I should say. One is the opportunists, and the other are the go-along crowd. Okay, what are the opportunists? The opportunists might be those individuals who are engaged in, for instance, something like insider trading. They get the opportunity, they don't think they're going to get caught, they seize the opportunity, they make the money, they commit that activity. But if they weren't given the opportunity, they wouldn't necessarily go out and do it. And then there's the go-along. What are the go-alongs? They are individuals who get swept up by the misdeeds or pressure of their environment and convince themselves that what they are doing is really not so bad because everybody else in the room is agreeing it's not so bad. And if the message from the executive suites is max out profits, come hell or high water, and go along, then that's exactly what this crowd might do. And that's exactly what's happening, at least in part, at Lehman Brothers. If the message from the top is do the right thing and we won't tolerate that sort of conduct, then they're not going to go along. They are more likely to stand up and prevent it from taking place. Recently, we lauded and encouraged risk-taking without setting boundaries or recognizing the consequences of such an attitude. The mantra was that the market run by masters of the universe and would correct itself. Ethical considerations may be lost in the flush of good times. Why ask tough questions when the system is really working? Not only do the good times mask the questionable conduct, they encourage us to relax our vigilance. So what happened with Lehman Brothers? It is a classic example of excessive practices. Lehman had historically been in the brokerage or moving business. Lehman typically acquired assets for short-term resale or redistribution, pocketing substantial fees in the progress. But in 2006, Lehman made a decision, a faithful decision, blessed by the board. It would take on more risk in order to make huge profits. It would concentrate those risks in commercial real estate. And it would take on more long-term risk as a principal, meaning they would be an owner rather than simply passing it through. On March 20th, 2007, the board of Lehman Brothers had a meeting in which management announced, quote, virtually all subprime originators have cut back in their operation or gone out of business, close quote. But despite that fact, management had concluded that, quote, current distressed environment provides a substantial opportunities for real estate investment. One of the executives in an off-campus meeting described it, we are going pedal to the metal. We are going pedal to the metal and we are going to make a lot of money. That's actually the quote from the document itself. The board signed off and agreed with this approach. Dr. Henry Kaufman, who is considered one of the more brilliant financiers of his day, you can read him in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the op-ed page all of the time, said that in essence, Lehman made the decision with the board, quote, to double down, close quote. Remember those words. Hoping to profit from a counter-cyclical strategy. Lehman bet its future that the subprime crisis would not spread outside of the housing market and move to other parts of the economy. And by the way, if you pick up the Wall Street Journal from that same period of time, you can see quotes from Chairman Bernanke saying that's exactly what his belief was too. By the latter part of 2007, there was a growing awareness that there was a spreading crisis in the subprime market. Lehman found itself struggling to sell or syndicate or securitize these very assets, which it now owns. They were becoming increasingly illiquid. People didn't want to buy them. As they described them in email after email, they were sticky assets. Lehman found itself no longer in the moving business. They were now in the storage business. Lehman's decision to double down on commercial real estate was a mistaken business judgment. Had the counter-cyclical strategy been right, Lehman would have been called visionary. They are instead called, in a bankruptcy court, debtor in possession. The law provides business, as it should, with significant room to make mistakes in business judgment. Mistakes in business judgment are made every day in corporate boardrooms and by management. Mistakes in business judgment do not automatically translate into ethical wrongdoings. But, as the story unfolds, you'll see that there are issues here where ethical questions are raised. Lehman's bad bet on real estate put it in a financial extremis. You may be too young to have seen Wall Street, the original Wall Street movie, but there is a great scene where the elderly ethical trader had a message for the ambitious young Bud Fox, who ended up in FBI handcuffs at the end of the movie. And it goes, quote, "The main thing about money, Bud, is it makes you do things you don't want to do," close quote. And Lehman did things it shouldn't have done. Lehman had a state-of-the-art system to track risk. They were called risk limits. All of you are familiar with that. Internal stop signs saying to them, you've exceeded this limit and the risk that you're going to undertake can have consequences for your entity. It is a corporate equivalent of a fire alarm system. And Lehman was touted by the SEC and others as having one of the most sophisticated systems on Wall Street. Truly brilliant people running this program. There was no statute or regulation which said that Lehman's risk limits must be thus and so. The limit was not set by statute. It was up to Lehman to decide how much risk they wanted to undertake. But the assurance for the public and others was that they had limits which were internal, which they had done, and that they were going to follow them. So it wasn't a legal issue. It was some other type of issue, and you can decide what that is. There were two problems. The limits themselves were guidelines, not actual limits. And Lehman made the calculated decision to ignore them without telling anybody outside that they were doing so. And as they blew past these self-imposed limits, they simply raised it. So if the speed limit was 55 and you're doing 60, well, now the speed limit is 65. And then when you're doing 70, the speed limit is 80. And they kept moving it up, chasing those profits and believing that by taking on this risk, there was an enormous reward on the other side. In essence, it was an exercise in self-deception. It's the corporate equivalent of a family that sets a strict budget, then spends whatever it wants to spend. It becomes a meaningless piece of paper. The risk limits at Lehman were whatever management wanted them to be. Second, while Lehman had extensive formulas to measure the risk in individual investments, there were serious gaps in these measurements. Management advised the board that in fact they were measuring all risks, but that wasn't true. Lehman's commercial real estate transactions were so sophisticated and so unknowable that they couldn't be measured. They didn't know how to measure the risks involved in these transactions. So they simply didn't. They measured all other risks, but didn't measure those risks, which turned out to be the fatal risks. When Lehman went down, it was because of that area. And so Lehman passed stress tests that didn't even begin to measure where the risks were really located. When Lehman, in the summer of 2008, finally measured the risks in the commercial real estate area, it turned out to be 3 times more than what they thought. But by that time, it was game over. Lehman's board signed off on Lehman's decision to double down, gobble up real estate. That was an appropriate exercise in business judgment. It didn't implicate ethical questions. But Lehman did not realistically assess its risk or take meaningful action to bring its risk within limits. Lehman's self-deception about its risk limit helped to mask the true extent of Lehman's question. Should someone have spoken up and done something about that? By the spring of 2008, it was no secret that Lehman was in trouble. After Bear Stearns' near failure in March of 2008, Secretary Paulson called up Dick Fuld and told him that Lehman had to do something about the situation. When Lehman announced its first ever quarterly loss in June of 2008, Secretary Paulson had a conversation with Dick Fuld. He said it was urgent to find a buyer or find another way to deal with this issue. And he said he had until the next quarter, or by Paulson's estimation, the market wasn't going to tolerate what was going to happen. But by then, it may have been in part too late. We found an email from Donald L. Cohn, who is the vice chairman of the Fed, in which he quotes what's happening on the street. Excuse me. And the quote is this, quote, "The question is when and how Lehman goes out of business, not if," close quote. And after that, between June and September, billions of shares of Lehman stock were traded, purchased and sold on the market. Lehman's business model, like all investment banks at the time, was inherently fragile, founded upon enormous leverage that permitted the opportunity for huge returns, but at huge risk. Unlike traditional banks, they could not use customer funds for liquidity. Rather, investment banks had to get their daily financing, if you will, in short-term repo market. A repo is nothing more or less than I pledge a certain amount of security, you give me cash for 24 hours, and then I return the security and give you a little bit additional money for having lent me the cash. Lehman literally entered into billions and tens of billions of dollars of repo transactions every day. That's how they financed their operation. But it was important, confidence. Confidence, because if in fact those who would lend you the money no longer believed you could repay it, they would no longer lend you the money, you were out of business. So they had to maintain confidence. In the spring of 2008, there were two words that made a great deal on Wall Street and to Lehman Brothers: liquidity and leverage. Someday you're going to find yourself in an executive suite or otherwise, and you're going to be asked, what do you do with this tough question? Do the right thing or the expedient thing? And we're going to focus on what happens next. Those questions were posed to Lehman executives. In the first part of 2008, Wall Street investors, rating agencies, were increasingly concerned about leverage. They wanted Lehman's leverage down. Leverage is simple. It's shorthand. It tells the street whether you're overextended. It's like, do you have 10% down on your home mortgage, you got 5%, or you got 50%? Assets and liability divided by capital. So there were two ways that they could reduce the leverage. They could bring in additional capital, or they could dispose of assets. They could sell assets. The problem in bringing in additional capital, as Dick Fuld told me, was that it was concern that might signal to the street that they needed money. And it might dilute the pre-existing shareholders. So they didn't want to do that. So they could sell their assets. But remember, these are sticky assets now. So what happens, and Secretary Geithner called this to my attention when we interviewed him, what happens if they sell an asset that they have marked at worth at $100, but they sell it for $70? Well, they get a haircut of $30, right? Something else happens too. It signals to the street that maybe all your other assets are overpriced. And maybe that starts a run on the bank. So, what to do? Lehman found a third way. It's called fudge the numbers. They couldn't sell assets, and they couldn't raise money. So they did the expedient thing. Lehman used an accounting device referred to as Repo 105 to report lower leverage numbers than existed that were in reality. Repos are typically accounted for as a financing. I'm just putting up a security and you're giving me money. It's nothing more or less than a borrowing. But there was a way that they could get around this and consider this transaction a sale rather than a financing. What they needed to do was get the legal opinion of a lawyer who would advise them that in the jurisdiction in which the transaction occurred, it could be treated as a sale. There are a couple other things that go along with it, but this is not an econ class, but just take that as the given. But they couldn't find a lawyer in the United States to tell Lehman Brothers that they could do that under US law. So they went to Great Britain, and they found a law firm in Great Britain that would say under British law, if you did the transaction with the bells and whistles on it, you could treat it as a sale. So at the close of each quarter, just before they made their public filings, which would disclose their leverage, they moved $50 billion worth of assets, literally sold them to their subsidiary in London as a wash, no profit or loss. And that subsidiary would then sell the assets on a repo sort of transaction, financing transaction, but they would be able to book it as a sale. Then they would be able to hold a press conference, which they did, and while they announced that they, in fact, their financials balance sheet was that they had losses for the year, they were able to announce good news, and the good news is we've dramatically lowered our leverage numbers. That was the good news. And look at our financial statement. 3 days after the press conference and after they filed those statements, the $50 billion moves back to the United States. So the leverage numbers go down while we report it to the public, and they go right back up the day after the public comments are made. Here's what Lehman executives at the time said in their internal email. That the sole reason for this was to manipulate the numbers. One of the top executives described it as quote unquote window dressing. Another described it as quote an accounting gimmick. Third announced it as quote a lazy way of managing the balance sheet. A fourth asked the question, how would the street react if they found out what we're doing? And finally, the president of Lehman Brothers, in an email which I find remarkable, describes it as, quote, another drug we are on, close quote. The Fitch rating agency, when we disclosed these facts to them, asked them what did they think. They responded, quote, sounds like a fraud, close quote. While we concluded that the conduct of the board of directors did not give rise to colorable claim, in hindsight, their conduct and their lack of questioning does not flatter. Boards in the future, frankly, in my opinion, are going to be held to a much higher standard. But management certainly could have done better. The government could have done better. Don't take my word for it. When we interviewed Chairman Bernanke, he said we all could have done better, including the Fed. But that's not the point. The point is if we have to wait for the government to do it, we're too far down that road. The key issue and lesson that we need to learn is whether an officer, employee, board member, government official needs to take individual responsibility for their action and for ownership of their action and to ensure that, in fact, the organization is doing the right thing. With regard to risk, the SEC knew that Lehman was blowing past its risk limits. They just didn't understand the consequences, and they didn't understand what they were looking at. They had specific knowledge, but they did not require Lehman to disclose to the public what was taking place, and they didn't require Lehman to stop doing it. That could have only happened if Lehman's executives had made that decision. They did not. SEC knew about the off-balance sheet transactions in Enron. You would have thought one of the first questions they would have asked of Lehman Brothers when they were there was, are you engaging in any off-balance sheet transactions to make yourself look better? Someone might have said, well, we've got this Repo 105. You ought to take a look at this puppy. But they didn't ask that question. But someone within Lehman could have stopped it. But it wasn't the government's failure to uncover and disclose Lehman's problem that caused its failure. Lehman's failure was created by its own bad decisions. In the abstract here at Ethos Week, the answers to some of these questions that Lehman faced may seem simple. But Lehman faced these questions in the crucible of an economy barreling towards a recession. And Lehman was fighting for its survival. Simple legal questions and simple ethical issues became very fuzzy during that period of time for a lot of very talented people. I'm revealing my age, which I will, when I called the question a movie called The Graduate. I'm not even going to ask anybody how many's seen it here. I'm going to look at some of the older people, not the younger people. But there is in that movie a great line in which the bore, who is saying, Benjamin, you got to do this and what have you, says, there's one word you've got to remember, and that word is plastics. There you go. Well, here's the one word you should remember, Transparency. Transparency. Had Lehman's executives challenged the purpose and use of repo, it would have forced the disclosure of the true leverage numbers. Had Lehman's executives thereafter disclosed the true leverage numbers, Wall Street would have had a better warning of Lehman's dire straits, and maybe months to prepare, which would have prevented the precipitous disaster which resulted. Had the government insisted that Lehman be more transparent about its risk, its liquidity, its leverage, its off-balance sheet transactions, Lehman's deterioration would have unfolded as a gradual evolution that markets might have been able to absorb rather than a cataclysmic event when the truth was finally revealed on September 14th, 2008. When the truth became known, Lehman, the industry, the government had 72 hours to try to prevent a disaster. They came close. A deal was almost reached, but at the end they could not do it. 72 hours was simply not enough time to have this accomplished. Had there been transparency, there would have been more time. And with more time, there would have been more options. And with more options, maybe Lehman would not have become, as the American lawyer described it, as, quote, shorthand for the collapse of the American economy. Thank you very much.